Okay, and you're live.
Hello, good morning to Gulf Specimens Marine Lab live stream. This is our 7th live stream, and we are very happy to have those of you who are returning students essentially for marine science. So today our topic is going to be snails. Snails are mollusks. That's virtually anything with a hard shell and a soft foot and soft body. And snails are the biggest group of mollusks. They're in a group called gastropods. And we're going to try and show you some of the features that make them snails. Number one, they have a single spiraled shell. That's what you're all used to seeing. You know, we have one here. These are the shells you really want to find at the beach usually, okay? And if you go to a beach in Florida or other coastal areas, you want to pick up a shell guide if that's something you're really interested in. That helps you identify the various kinds of shells and tells you oftentimes a little bit about the live animals that inhabit them, and that's what we want to focus on today. But they also have a well-developed head, okay, usually with tentacles. And I'm going to try and find you, we've got a bunch of examples out here, one that is showing off his head. Here, this little cowrie is doing a good job. This is the head end, and this is the mouth right in the middle, if you can see it. And he's got a special little organ in there that also is typical of all the snails. It's called a radula, and it's like a long ribbon of tongue that instead of being anchored in just one part of the mouth, it's anchored both at the front and back of the mouth, and it's got lots of little teeth on it. And they use that to scrape either algae off the bottom or the seagrass or a rock, or if they're a predatory snail, they use it to rasp the meat away from the prey organism and ingest it. Now, they also have a big muscular foot, and the cowrie is also showing off his big muscular foot. And here's another one. I'm going to bring it over here so we can get it in the shot. But right here you see this is a crown conch, and this is the big muscly foot. And while we're over here by the cowrie, I want to show you another thing that is typical of mollusks. Not just snails, but any mollusk has this little membrane called the mantle. And in the cowrie, it's got like little fingers on it, okay? And usually it engulfs that whole shell, so that when you find a cowrie shell, it's usually beautiful and it looks like it's been polished, and that's because the shell itself is rarely exposed to the water. Usually that mantle helps protect it. But the mantle is very important in all mollusks. It helps to secrete the shell if they have one. It's got a muscular layer that helps make the siphons. Those are the little tubes that pull water into mollusks and push it back out of them after it's gone over the gills. And it's also usually sensory, like a little antenna that you could see on that cowrie, eyes, and any sensory organ is usually made from a section of the mantle. So the mantle is very important. So single spiraled shell, well-developed head, big muscular crawling foot that's used to creep across the bottom usually, and a radula. And if it's got most of those things, it's probably going to be a snail of some sort. And we have a wide variety of snails that are found here in the Northern Gulf. This lovely deer cowrie is just one of them. Cowries are found in all the world's tropical oceans, and sometimes they used to be used for money in some primitive cultures. You may have heard of money cowries, but that's very typical of those. Now, I want to show you, and I'm going to pull this out of the water because he's not cooperating anyway. This is the Florida state shell, and it's a big gastropod called a horse conch. And it's not a member of the true conch family, but it has this amazing orange flesh. And here you can see this is called the siphonal canal. This is where the siphon extends down into the water, and he pulls water up over his gills. And this is a feature of most snails. This is called an operculum. Operculum means door. And he's releasing water from that flesh so he can pull it all back in, and he's going to close himself off entirely with this operculum or door, and that will keep him safe inside the shell and away from a lot of predators. This is a big predatory snail, and he literally, when he's open and exposed, he just kind of mows down other smaller snails or clams, and then they squirt digestive juices. They kind of regurgitate digestive juices and into the organism and let it liquefy some, and then they can suck it back up with their mouth. Is very tube-like, kind of like a straw. Now, that material that makes up the operculum is a very thick protein called conchiolin, and it's also found on the outside of a lot of snails. And this is called a hairy triton. This has a large number of extensions of the periostracum on this snail that help protect it and protect the shell some from damage. So, but you can see he also has a little operculum in here. Look at his mantle. It's like spotted. It's so wonderful. I love that. That's gorgeous. Now, I'm going to ask Alkin to come over here to this horse conch, which is not nearly as big as the one I just showed you. Horse conchs will get up to 2 feet long. So they're a really, really large snail. This one we caught earlier feeding on this pin shell. We interrupted his lunch and he's not really gotten quite back to it, but he had that big muscular foot all the way up inside that shell, and my guess is he was using the radula, that ribbon of teeth, to tear flesh off the pin shell and consume it. Now, I only have one herbivorous snail, and that's this one. This one's called the Florida fighting conch, and it is in the true conch family. And all of the true conchs, like that big pink conch that you always associate with Florida and you find down in the Florida Keys, they have this big, thick lip on the outside of the opening. Here you can see his little eyes, and they've got a little hook-shaped operculum that when you put him in with a predatory snail like the horse conch over there, he starts using that operculum to just jump around. You want to see if he'll do that? I know he did it last time. But this is an herbivore. He normally would feed on algae like this sea lettuce here. I'll stick him back underneath there. My other herbivorous snail does not have a shell. Some snails have lost the shell, and this one, okay, I'm going to move these little guys. This is a murex with these beautiful spines here, and this is what we call a sea hare, the ragged sea hare. And this is a snail that is herbivorous, like the crown conchs, but it does not have a shell. Now, most of those snails that have a shell are kind of folded in half, and they actually, the rear end of the animal gets folded on top of the front end of the animal. And that presents snails with a rather unusual problem. They have to figure out some way or evolve some way so that they don't poop on their head. Nobody wants to poop on their head. And most of the more advanced snails have lost some organs, and they have a current of water that comes up through the snail, over the gills, and then across the anus, and it takes the fecal material away from the animal. But some of the primitive snails have little openings. Like this little shell is from what's called a keyhole limpet. And we think the ancient ancestral snails had this kind of little cone-shaped, kind of hat-shaped shell. And this opening is where the anal opening released the fecal material so that it wouldn't end up on the head end of the snail, which is over this way, so that as he moves, the currents carry all of the fecal material away. Abalones are a primitive snail, and they have that little series of holes is where the anus, as the snail has grown, the anus has moved, and it makes a new little hole so that it can move all the fecal material over to one side. Now, it just happens that this is springtime here in northern Florida, and everyone's thoughts have turned to love, and we have lots and lots of snails that are laying eggs. This little sea hare here laid this little rope of eggs. Now, that was easy for him because he's a hermaphrodite. He has both male and female parts, and he or she can fertilize his own eggs. And but that is not true of most snails. Most snails, you have a male animal and a female animal. This little murex is a female animal, and I know that because she laid this little cluster of eggs. And in each of these little capsules are a bunch of tiny little eggs, and depending on the snail, there may be several dozen to several hundred inside each little capsule that will eventually hatch out. I want to show you one of our most common snails. That's this little guy right here. This is called a lightning whelk, and it's a beautiful little predatory snail. Likes to eat clams. It eats those clams by sticking this little shell in between the two shell of the clams or the scallop, and then it can insert its mouth and release those enzymes that dissolve the prey and allow him to suck it all back up. But when this guy lays eggs, they look like this. They're not this big from that guy. This was laid by a much bigger lightning whelk. Okay, but if I hold this up to the light, you can see a bunch of developing little snails in there. And when they have completed their development, they will secrete an enzyme. There's like a little hole here. I'm going to show you on these dried egg cases. If you look right in the middle of that dried capsule, you see a little hole. And these also have that hole, but it's not open yet, because when the snails are ready to hatch out, they will secrete that enzyme that allows the opening to open up, and all the little snails will crawl out. Now, he has a close relative here called a pear whelk, and this is the pear whelk, and they don't usually get quite as big as the lightning whelks, and their eggs are very similar, but the ribbon of egg cases has kind of a different angle to it, and with practice you can tell the difference between the lightning whelk eggs and the pear whelk eggs. And then another thing I want to show you about this little snail while we've got it here. We have lots of predatory snails. Some of them are drills, and they actually have an acidic saliva, and they will spit that saliva on top of another snail or clam, and then they'll use their radula like a little file to go back and forth, and it will make a little hole in the organism, and then they can insert their mouth and release the digestive enzymes and liquefy that material and feed on it. This one managed to get away from his predator at 5, and the mantle is filling in that hole ever so slightly, but he'll have a scar there for as long as he lives. Now this snail is called a tulip snail, and I'm going to pull him up off the bottom here. He's firmly attached. Another predatory snail. But I want you to see he's this beautiful kind of blackish purple color. You see this gorgeous big foot and the operculum that's going to shut him inside there so that he is protected. But this tulip snail laid these eggs, and they're kind of triangular in shape, and they've got like a little ruffle at the top. And there is a little hole right in the very middle of the top of that cone. And when those baby snails have their little shell and are ready to come join the rest of the marine world, then they'll secrete that enzyme that opens that up. But I love that. You can see these eggs have not been laid very long ago. They have a real pink color yet, which is what you see in the snails. Let me see if I can hold this. I'm sorry, Allison. Oops. Right here, you see all of that pink in there. Those are the developing, that's the little feet of those little purpley black kind of snails that are developing. And I'm going to stick that back in the water so that it stays nice and fresh. And while we're looking at eggs, I want to talk about this little guy. This is a crown conch, nice big muscly foot, operculum to close everybody off. This is our major predator on oysters. We've talked about him in another live feed, and he's called a crown conch because he has these big spires on each whorl. It makes it look like a little crown. But when she lays her eggs, the females, they're in these little envelopes, essentially. And I read that they can have up to 200 little developing snails inside that envelope. And I've also read that in some species, the little snails that develop the fastest eat on the yolks of the other little snails and consume them before they have a chance to hatch. But these are the crown conch eggs. And Allison, I'm going to move over here, and we're going to show some of the eggs the way you would see them. All these are live eggs, and we've pulled them out of tanks, but oftentimes you see the eggs the way they wash up on the beach. These are the lightning wealth eggs. I showed you those over there. These are the eggs from a horse conch. They're very similar to the tulip snail. They've got those little cones. They've got little ridges. Okay, here, this is a banded tulip, also related. Nope, that's the true tulip. I'm lying. This is the banded one. These are the little egg cases from that snail. This is the little murex, the egg case I showed you first, the way they would look if they washed up on the beach. These are some of those little envelopes from the crown conch, the way you might find them if they got washed up during a storm. These are from the pear whelk. And then I want to draw your attention to these. These are so neat. These are called collars, moon snail collars. And this is a moon snail. or the shell of a moon snail. I have a live one I'm going to dig up in here in a minute and show you, because they walk around on a really big foot. But when they lay eggs, the material, the gelatinous material that the eggs are in, is secreted right along the edge of the shell, and it curls right around the snail shell and gets embedded with lots and lots of sand. And that's what forms these little collars. When you find these on the beach, sometimes if you hold them up to the light, and they won't dry nice and hard like these, the woman who collected these preserved them with a lacquer material, because they just crumble apart because they're mostly sand when you find them on the beach. But if you hold them up, you can see little round eggs in there. And I'm going to put this right around this little moon snail, so that you can kind of get some idea of, when that moon snail is laying the eggs, how that little collar would wrap around there. And I also want to talk about these little eggs. These little eggs have all this purple color, and they are produced by these little rock snails. And this belongs to the family of snails that they used to collect in the ancient Mediterranean, and they made royal purple, that very, very expensive dye that you may have heard about from biblical times. And these little snails have quite a bit of that purple that gets deposited in the egg cases themselves. So these are the eggs from this little snail. And then these eggs, sometimes we just find these all over. These are from a tiny little snail called a nutmeg shell. Cantharis is the genus name, but this one's got the pretty kind of nutmeg color that gave the snails their name. But they lay lots and lots and lots of these little capsules over any little hard surface they can find. Another shell, or in this case, some piece of, I don't know, plastic material that has ended up in the ocean. But they will lay them on virtually anything. Okay, let's go back to our little sand tank, and I'm going to show you some of the things. I know I have a moon snail in here. And I'm just going to kind of feel around in the sand to see if I can find that moon snail, because I want you to see what it looks like alive. It's a little hard to find sometimes. Here's a little rock snail, Thais, or Thais, however you choose to pronounce it. And that's the one that had the little purple eggs. Here we go. Here's my little moon snail. Now he's gone all the way to the bottom of the sand. And there he is, and he's already pulled in most of his big foot, just in the time that it took me to get him up off of the bottom. And he's going to release water from that. Sometimes when you pull them up out of the water, I've had kids go, "Oh, it's peeing on me." It's not really peeing on him. It's just releasing all the water from the flesh so that it can fit that flesh back into the shell and shut the little operculum door and be safe from predators. Now, a lot of snails are predators, but there are also quite a few snails that are scavengers. And I'm going to take this little piece of fish here, and we're just going to put it on the sand. And there are several snails that are buried up under that sand that are scavengers that I hope come to the top quickly, or you'll see their little siphons coming up out of the sand, because as the fish odor begins to travel away, see this little guy's already, he's going under, but he's starting to move towards that fish. So it's the little rock snail. Here I see another little, these are called pygmy dogwinkles. He hasn't gotten a good whiff yet, I don't think. But they are all, they should begin soon to pick up on that odor and come to scavenge the flesh from that piece of fish. This is another snail that's very common in our area. If you go to the beach, oftentimes at the beach, one of the things that people notice is there are little clams that keep digging back in every time the wave comes in. These little snails, which are called augurs, are feeding on those little clams. And this snail is fairly closely related to cone snails. And those of you who have traveled to parts of the Pacific and the tropics know that cone snails are one of those things they warn you about because they're toxic. And on their radula, they have one long, pointy, spear-like tooth. And when they encounter a prey item, they throw that little spear-like tooth at them and release a toxin. And in the Pacific, some of them are toxic enough to hurt humans. But these also have that single tooth that apparently they throw into the foot of those little clams to capture them to feed on. Let's see if this one is really showing off his little head and his muscular foot. But my little olive snails are not coming for the fish. Do you think they know it's...
Yep, look.
There. I can see sign. Oftentimes when you go to the beach, you'll see like little trails.
There's a siphon in there.
And, oh yeah, you can see the little siphon is coming up to kind of home in on that yummy fish odor.
And this guy's getting closer.
Allison, do we have any questions yet?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Oh, do you want to talk about your macaroni shells?
Oh, I do want to talk about those. I'd be happy to. This is a colony of snails. These are called worm snails. And these, when the larvae settle down, they can sniff out other worm snails so that they all tend to settle in the same area. And as the snail grows, instead of the whorls being nice and tight and forming that little spiral shell that we're used to, as it grows, the whorls get looser and looser and looser until you get these little things. But this means that this snail cannot go out and about like these snails can and look for their food. These are plankton feeding snails, and you'll only find colonies of worm snails like this in an area with a really good current where the water is bringing in lots of food for them to feed on. Gets a lot of other things start living inside these little crevices and crannies as well. Here, I'm going to, while they're digging towards that, see this little snail, I'm going to look for one of these olive snails that maybe is not right over there. Because, like the cowrie, olive snails have a mantle that they keep extended much of the time. And that allows them to, their shell stays very, very shiny It's one of those shells that when you are at the beach, you're going, oh, I wish I could find one of those.
Oh, Susanna Perry Craig asks, what is your favorite snail?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
All the
I like the sea hares and probably horse conch. Those are just because there's, what else is that bright tangerine orange color? Okay, here's that little olive snail. This is the lettered olive, and he's got just a tiny little opening where his foot comes out, but he really wants to be over here on that fish where he can use that little rasp-like radula and tear the meat off of there for dinner. He's a great scavenger, and they are found very commonly in nice shallow water, 3, 4 feet, 20 feet. You don't usually find them out in deeper water.
Susanna asks, can you please tell us one more time which one are the most common here on the Florida Gulf?
Okay, most common. Olives are certainly one of the most common. Lightning whelks are very common, like this one. Tulip snails are pretty common.
He's not letting go?
Nope. Like this one. The pear whelk's not quite as common as the lightning whelk, but it's pretty common. It's got a rounder shell. Now, a lot of these that are small are probably very, very common, like this little pygmy dog whelk. Those are just, sometimes if you put something dead out on the sand, hundreds of these show up. And they're much more common than you might think. Periwinkles, which are in the salt marsh, are another very common snail in our area. Crown conchs are quite common, and particularly around oyster reefs. These are very, very common. This is the biggest oyster predator in our area. These little rock snails, like this one, this little theas. This is a common oyster predator off Mississippi and Alabama. Very, very common. In fact, when I was working in, we had a year where we had over 400 of these per square meter on oyster reefs, because the oysters were in decline, and these little guys were just in huge numbers feeding on oysters on the reefs.
Okay, Teresa asks, what eats snails besides other snails?
What snails, what?
What eats snails besides other snails?
Oh, gosh. There are a number of fish that will eat snails. Drums, like both crustaceans and snails, they have a big plate of flat teeth in the back of their throat that they can crunch through that shell. So some of those fish eat snails.
How about triggerfish?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think triggerfish eat mostly urchins. So, but that is a really good question. I'll try and look that up. And online I'll share some of the things. I know that dolphins, I have heard that dolphins sometimes eat snails, but they must eat them whole if they eat them. Because I don't think they have mouth parts to really scrunch through that shell.
Do we eat snails?
Yes, we definitely eat snails, and Florida is famous for conch fritters and conch salad and cracked conch, and those are members of the this family that has this little snail. This is the Florida fighting conch. He's gotten a piece of fish here. He's But most often these are herbivores, and yeah, we take those snails and cut them up because the body of the snail is very, very meaty, and they make soup, conch chowder. They cut it up and cook it very quickly and put it in salads. I know that off the coast of Mississippi, I was served one time conch spaghetti that was made with lightning whelks. They had run into a bunch of small lightning whelks, and rather than waste them, they cooked them all up in a marinara sauce, and they were delicious. So yes, there are a number of snails that we eat.
How do they taste like?
You know, usually it's more a texture thing for me than it is a whole lot of taste. They have a real chewy, meaty texture, and the only snail, I must admit, I was served live snails once in Hawaii, and to be polite, I ate them, and they tasted just horrible, like you might expect a raw snail to taste. So I was not happy with that, but I've eaten cracked conch, and that's also raw snail, and that was quite good. But they kind of cook it in lime juice and stuff, kind of like you would ceviche, so it doesn't taste raw.
Okay. Robert E. Doe asks, do birds eat snails?
I'm sure there are some birds that eat snails, and I have seen film footage of them taking snails and dropping them onto rocks in order to break the shell, and then they can pull the animal out of the shell. But we don't have many rocks here.
Snail kites?
Yeah, we do have snail kites here in Florida, and they eat a freshwater snail called an apple snail. That's a nice, big, beautiful, large freshwater snail found all through the Everglades. So snail kites eat those, and also wading bird eat those.
Okay, 3 of snails are there on the Gulf Coast.
I don't know, Teresa. I wish
Thousands.
Yeah, I'm sure there are thousands. There are about 40,000, I read, worldwide, different types of gastropods, and they're I wouldn't even know where to start for the Gulf. The Gulf is not as diverse as some places. You know, some places in the tropics and have a lot more diversity and would probably have more snails in those areas than we do.
Okay. Brian asks, what is their habitat like in the ocean?
Well, it depends on the snail. Some snails like a real rocky habitat, like the little limpets. They love a rocky habitat, and they go out and feed, and then they come back to the same spot on the rock and stay right there. So, but most of our snails like a nice sand bottom, okay, like you would find off of our beaches. Some snails like what they call shell hash. It has a lot of shelly material in the bottom, but grass beds is another important habitat for a lot of these snails. Particularly grass beds that have a lot of scallops. They have cross-barred Venus, a number of small clams that are excellent food for these. I know the first time I ever collected a tulip, I put it in my little dye bag with 3 scallops. I came home, I had no scallops. I had shells of scallops, but no scallops. And so grass beds are another place where you would find those snails.
Okay, Abigail asks, are there snails that lay eggs outside of water?
I don't. There are land snails that must lay eggs.
Garden
completely
snails.
out of water. But some of those land snails, instead of laying eggs, give live birth to little snails. Okay, but I'm sure there's some land snail that has eggs. But even freshwater snails, the eggs are usually laid in the water or right at the water's edge. Apple snails, some apple snails lay the eggs just above the water where they get splashed a lot, but not down in it.
Okay, Teresa asks, do crabs eat snails?
Crabs love snails if they can get at them. And on one of our live streams, we showed you a flame box crab, and they have a neat little claw that is built like a can opener, and they put that little claw right in the edge here of the shell, and they break it all the way open until they can get the snail out. They also eat hermit crabs, but they'll eat snails.
How do you tell the age of a snail?
I don't know. I don't know. And I have heard that horse conchs that, you know, get to 2 feet live 40 to 60 years. But I don't know how they determine that.
Well, okay, that's it for questions.
Okay. Well, next week we're going to do seahorses. So join us again. We'll talk about seahorses and pipefish, which are a neat little group of fish.
Okay, thank you guys for joining us. Bye.